Each night, a candle is lit, and the whispering tomes open. Inside are the strange, the forgotten, the stories time tried to silence. Some say history is written by the victors, but here the lost are given voice. Breathe deeply and follow me into the hidden chapters of history.
In the quiet hills of what is now Slovakia, a pale fortress rises above the forests. Čachtice Castle, its weathered stone, stark against the endless sky, has watched over this valley for centuries. Its walls once held banquets, whispers, prayers, and secrets. But today, it is remembered for the woman who lived within its embrace, Elizabeth Báthory. Before she became a dark legend, she was simply a child of privilege, born in 1560 into the mighty Bathory family. Her cradle was surrounded by immense wealth, political influence, and the shadow of power. The Bathorys were one of the most powerful families in Hungary, tied by blood to princes, warriors, and even a king. Her upbringing was not only rich in comfort, but also heavy with expectation. Every gesture, every lesson, every word spoken to her was designed to shape her into a figure who would one day carry the weight of land, fortune, and a formidable name. The world she was born into was a land of constant tension. The Ottoman Empire relentlessly pressed against Hungary's borders, sparking decades of brutal conflict. Play inside the kingdom. Nobles clashed for power, their ambitions carving up the landscape, while peasants lived under the heavy burdens of tax, duty, and the ever-present threat of famine. The castle's walls may have felt secure, but beyond them stretched a land filled with deep uncertainty and fear. The people in the villages that dotted the hills would look up at Čachtice Castle and see more than just stone and mortar. They saw the hand that ruled their lives, the source of both their protection and their suffering. For Elizabeth, childhood was a strange mix of refined education and chilling shadows. She was exceptionally well educated, fluent in Latin, German, Hungarian, and Slovak, a rare achievement even among the nobility of her time. Tutors were hired to train her mind in politics and estate management, while a legion of servants ensured her every need was met. Yet this young noblewoman was also taught the harshness of discipline from a young age. Later rumors would claim that she witnessed extreme brutality even in her early years. Peasants punished with cruel precision, servants treated with merciless authority. Whether these stories are true or just the dramatic embroidery of later storytellers, they hint at a childhood that was both incredibly privileged and disturbingly severe. Imagine the corridors of her youth, dimly lit by the flickering orange glow of candles. Thick, heavy tapestries hung on the cold stone walls to keep the draughts at bay. The sounds of horses' hooves echoed in the courtyards, a constant reminder of the comings and goings of soldiers and messengers. Armored men patrolled the gates, their presence a symbol of the family's power. From the high windows of the castle, a young Elizabeth could look out and see endless forests, stretching out like dark, rolling oceans, interrupted only by small patches of farmland and the distant, fragile lights of villages. It was a world where power meant survival, and survival often meant absolute control. By the time she was a teenager, Elizabeth was already bound by duty to her family's grand ambitions. At the tender age of 15, she was married to Count Ferenc Nadasdy, another powerful figure in the Hungarian aristocracy. Their union was far more than a romance. It was a strategic alliance, a political merger designed to secure lands, titles, and armies. Their wedding was a spectacular affair, attended by thousands, filled with days of music, lavish feasts, and ancient rituals. While villagers celebrated with dances and bread, the nobles exchanged quiet vows of loyalty and whispered schemes of intrigue. In the flickering torchlight of her wedding night, Elizabeth became not only a bride, but also the mistress of vast estates, and the wife of a man who would become known as the Black Knight of Hungary. Her husband, Ferenc, was a celebrated soldier, but he was often away at war, leading brutal campaigns against the Ottomans. He earned his nickname for a reason, feared for his ferocity and cruelty in battle. Back at home, it was Elizabeth who was left in charge. She was tasked with managing their many lands, their hundreds of servants, and their formidable castles, including Lac. This responsibility gave her immense power at a very young age. She oversaw the collection of taxes, the care of the peasants on her lands, the punishment of disobedient servants, and the endless, intricate details of running a noble estate. Her decisions, her word, reached into every corner of her domain, affecting the lives of thousands. It was during these years, while she held the reins of power in her husband's absence, that the first dark shadows began to gather around her name. Some accounts claim she was strict to the point of being exceptionally cruel. Servants were said to fear her sharp temper, her cold, penetrating stare, and her willingness to punish even minor infractions without a hint of mercy. Others argue that these tales were born much later, woven from the threads of jealousy, political conspiracy, and the natural fear that common people felt toward a powerful and distant noblewoman. In the deafening silence of history, the absolute truth blurs, and we are left with a figure shrouded in mystery. What we know for certain is that Elizabeth Báthory was powerful, intelligent, and lived in a violent age. And with that kind of power, whispers are inevitable. As night fell, Čachtice Castle would sink into a profound silence, broken only by the groan of aging wood and the lonely howl of the wind against its stone towers. The villagers in the valley below would glance upward, their small torches glowing like fireflies against the darkness, and they would wonder what truly happened in those high, dark halls. To them, the castle was a place of deep mystery, filled with secrets they could never hope to fully understand. And as Elizabeth grew older, and as the wars dragged on, the shadows surrounding her only grew deeper, darker, and more menacing. By the early 1600s, the chilling whispers about Elizabeth Báthory were no longer just campfire stories told by peasants. They had slithered their way into the ears of the powerful clergy, nobles, and even the king himself. The death of her husband, the formidable warrior Count Ferenc Nadasti, had left Elizabeth in a vulnerable position. She was still immensely wealthy, with vast lands and a noble title, but she no longer had his shield. Her rivals, who had once been too intimidated to challenge her, now sensed an opportunity. The gruesome tales of her cruelty, once dismissed as folklore, were about to become their most potent weapons. The first to break the silence was a Jesuit priest, István Magyari. In 1602, he stood at the pulpit and publicly denounced the Countess, accusing her of unspeakable crimes. He claimed that a disturbing number of young women in her service were vanishing without a trace, and that Elizabeth was the one responsible. His words didn't just echo within the stone walls of his church. They traveled like wildfire, reaching nobles eager for a scandal and a king who had his own reasons to be interested. That king was Matthias II. At the time, Hungary was a fractured kingdom, strained by constant wars with the Ottoman Empire and torn apart by internal rivalries among the nobility. To a monarch struggling to maintain control, the enormous wealth of the Bathory estates was a prize tempting to ignore. If Elizabeth could be publicly disgraced, her lands and fortune could be seized and redistributed. The political stakes were sky-high, and scandal was the perfect key to unlock her treasury. Between 1602 and 1610, the accusations began to pile up. Dozens, then hundreds of witnesses were brought forward. Servants, peasants, local clergy, and even minor nobles came to testify. They wove a horrifying tapestry of cruelty, claiming that Elizabeth beat, starved, and mutilated her servant girls. They spoke of young women brought to Čachtice Castle, never to be seen again. They insisted that the fortress walls concealed horrors beyond anyone's darkest imagination. The most sensational claims transformed Elizabeth from a cruel mistress into a literal monster. Witnesses described her biting the flesh from her victims, stabbing them with needles, or forcing them to stand naked in the snow until they froze to death. And then there was the most enduring accusation of all, that she bathed in the blood of young virgins to preserve her own youth and beauty. This single gruesome image was so powerful, so unforgettable, that it would cement her place in folklore for centuries. It's the story everyone remembers. But how reliable were these testimonies? It's a question that historians still debate. Many of these accounts were gathered under extreme duress. We re-talking about frightened peasants and ambitious rivals who had everything to gain by telling the authorities what they wanted to hear. In an age where torture was a standard part of judicial proceedings, confessions were often shaped by the desires of the interrogators, not by the truth. So, did Elizabeth really commit all of these monstrous acts? Or was this a carefully constructed caricature, a portrait of evil painted by her enemies to orchestrate her destruction? What we know for certain is that by 1610, the tide had turned against her completely. That year, a powerful nobleman named Count György Thurzo, who was actually a relative of Elizabeth's, was ordered to lead an official investigation. Thurzo gathered a team and rode to the now infamous Čachtice Castle. What they found there, or what they claimed to find, would seal Elizabeth's fate forever. According to the official accounts, Thurzo and his men discovered several girls dead or dying within the castle walls. Servants, under interrogation, supposedly described in harrowing detail the torments that had taken place. Whether these discoveries were genuine or just a bit of staged political theater, they provided all the evidence Thurzo needed to satisfy the king and Elizabeth's many political rivals. But here, the story takes a very strange turn. Despite the mountain of horrifying testimony and the supposed evidence found at the castle, Elizabeth Báthory was never formally tried in a court of law. This was almost unheard of. Why? Perhaps her noble blood still offered some protection, shielding her from the public humiliation of a trial that a commoner would have faced. Or perhaps her enemies had already achieved their goal. They had the justification they needed to strip her of her power and seize her lands. A trial would have just been a messy formality. Whatever the reason, Elizabeth's fate was decided not by a judge and jury, but by a simple decree. She was sentenced to be imprisoned within her own fortress, Čachtice Castle. The predator was now caged. Some of the more dramatic accounts claim she was bricked into a set of rooms, with the walls completely sealed except for small slits left for air and food. Whether this image is a literal truth or a symbolic exaggeration, it has become fixed in our collective imagination. The once mighty countess, a prisoner in her own home, entombed in stone. For the villagers living in the shadow of the castle, there, or turned to a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. The fortress on the hill was no longer the home of a noble family. It was a tomb, guarding a dark secret. It held a woman whose presence was considered so dangerous, so corrupting, that even her freedom of movement within her own home had to be denied. And so, Elizabeth Báthory, the Blood Countess, faded from public life, left to live out her final years in silence, a legend trapped within the very walls that once defined her power. By the dawn of the 17th century, the name Elizabeth Báthory was no longer just a shadow whispered in village taverns. It had become a matter of official state concern, drawing priests, lawyers, and powerful nobles into its dark orbit. The whispers that once crept through the hamlets surrounding her castles had grown into a roar of formal accusation, and the stone walls of her fortress could no longer shield her from the world. The first voice to break the silence with authority belonged to István Magyari, a Jesuit priest. In 1602, he stood before his congregation and did the unthinkable. He didn't speak in riddles or veiled warnings. He spoke directly, naming Countess Elizabeth Báthory as a woman guilty of crimes that defied imagination. He declared she had grotesquely abused her power, that her servants vanished under the most sinister of circumstances, and that her cruelty demanded the attention of the king himself. In an era where a priest's word carried immense weight, this was no ordinary sermon. His accusations reached not just the peasants in the pews, but ears that carried them all the way to the royal court. From that moment on, it was as if a dam had broken. Testimony began to flood in. Other nobles, perhaps jealous of the vast Bathory estates, quietly encouraged the burgeoning investigations. Magistrates started recording statements from villagers who claimed to have seen unsettling things near the castle gates. Former servants, now free from her grasp, began to share their stories, and the more they were retold, the stranger they became. One young woman, a former maid, swore that the Countess would sometimes force her attendants to stay awake for nights on end. They would have to stand motionless, in perfect silence, in the castle's great hall, while Elizabeth moved among them like a phantom, watching, studying, and measuring their discipline. Another servant insisted she had been forced into an endless cycle of cleaning. Her work was deliberately undone, forcing her to repeat the same task over and over until she finally collapsed from sheer exhaustion. Soon, the testimonies numbered in the hundreds. Many were vague, coming from villagers who could only say that their daughters went to work at Čachtice Castle and were never seen again. But others were chillingly detailed. They spoke of long, dark corridors echoing with muffled cries, of young women locked in chambers for days at a time with barely any food. In these accounts, Elizabeth was transforming from a noblewoman into a figure of pure nightmare, one who had turned her own household into a twisted theatre of cruelty. However, the stories were riddled with contradictions. Some witnesses described elaborate and terrifying instruments of punishment, while others mentioned nothing of the sort. Some claimed there were dozens upon dozens of victims, while others insisted there were only a handful. A few people even defended the Countess, arguing that discipline in noble households was always severe, and that Elizabeth was no harsher than any other mistress of her standing. But we have to remember the context of the times. This was an age where torture was a standard tool for extracting testimony. Under such extreme pressure, it was common for peasants and servants to tell their interrogators exactly what they wanted to hear. Separating truth from coerced invention becomes almost impossible. Still, the image being constructed was incredibly powerful. And once a story gains that much power, it almost doesn't matter how much of it is actually real. The narrative takes on a life of its own. Eventually, the rising tide of accusations reached the ears of King Matthias II of Hungary. At this time, Hungary was a kingdom under immense strain. It was fractured by constant brutal wars with the Ottoman Empire and torn apart by the rivalries of its own ambitious noble houses. For the king, the charges against Elizabeth Báthory were not just a matter of justice or morality. They were a matter of cold, hard politics. If the Countess were proven guilty, her vast lands could be seized, her immense fortune redistributed, and her powerful family's influence decisively broken. For a ruler constantly desperate for resources to fund his armies and secure the loyalty of his supporters, this was a golden opportunity. And so, in 1610, the king made his move. He ordered Count György Thurzó, one of the most powerful nobles in the kingdom and, ironically, a relative of Elizabeth, to take personal charge of the investigation. Thurzó was a man known for his ambition and his careful calculations. He did not proceed lightly. He summoned witnesses from across the land, gathered sworn depositions, and sent his own men to examine the Countess's various estates. What he collected was a mountain of accusations, a meticulously documented dossier of horror that would shape the narrative that has survived for over 400 years. One of the strangest things about these records is how bizarrely specific some of the testimonies became. One servant claimed Elizabeth forced her attendants to kneel and recite prayers for hours on end, striking them viciously if their voices faltered even for a moment. Another spoke of elaborate, cruel games of endurance, where girls were ordered to perform pointless tasks without any pause. Any failure, any sign of weakness, became the grounds for punishment. These accounts, whether true, embellished, or entirely fabricated, painted a portrait not just of a strict mistress, but of a woman who derived a deep, perverse satisfaction from bending others completely to her will. For the villagers who only heard these stories second-hand, they grew taller and more terrifying with each retelling. In the taverns and around the flickering hearth fires, Elizabeth was no longer a human noble. She became a creature of shadow, a monster who could transform the ordinary things of household life, a flickering candle, the winter snow, the profound silence of a castle at night into instruments of torment. By the time Thurzo's men finally saddled their horses and rode towards Čachtice Castle, the legend of the Blood Countess had already been forged. What awaited them behind those stone walls would not only seal Elizabeth's fate, but would also grant her a dark and terrible immortality in the pages of history. Thank you so much. By the year 1610, Elizabeth Báthory's name was no longer a matter of rumor alone. It had become the subject of official inquiry, a matter that reached the ears of King Matthias II himself. The accusations against her were troubling, but even more troubling for the crown was the fortune attached to her family name. If she could be discredited, her lands might be seized, her wealth redistributed, and the influence of the Bathorys diminished. For a kingdom stretched thin by war and politics, it was a tempting prospect. The king appointed Count Georgy Thurzo, Palatine of Hungary, to lead the investigation. Thurzo was a man of power and reputation, known for his loyalty to the crown and his careful calculation in matters of law. He was also a relative of Elizabeth, which gave the appointment a sharp edge. He would be investigating his own kin, balancing blood ties against duty. Thurzo began by gathering testimonies. He sent word to villages across the region, summoning peasants, priests, and minor nobles to speak of what they had seen or heard. What he received was a storm of voices, each adding fragments to the growing image of Elizabeth. Some were vague, others detailed, some rooted in truth and others in imagination. A farmer swore that his daughter had gone to work at Čachtice Castle and never returned. He said he asked the servants at the gates, but they turned him away, saying the girl had been dismissed. Yet no one in the village ever saw her again. Another villager described seeing torches flickering at the castle windows long after midnight, when all should have been still. He claimed he heard faint cries carried on the wind, though he admitted he had never dared to climb the hill and look for himself. Former servants gave sharper accounts. One maid said she had been forced to stand motionless for hours in the great hall, holding a candle until the wax ran down onto her hands. Another claimed she had been made to scrub a room over and over until her knees bled from the stone floors. One even insisted that Elizabeth devised games of endurance, sending attendants to fetch buckets of water from the well again and again, emptying them onto the floor as soon as they were filled, laughing at their exhaustion. There were also stories that strayed toward the strange. A servant told of being awakened in the middle of the night, ordered to line up with the others in silence, and to pray aloud until dawn. Another insisted that Elizabeth sometimes studied her attendants closely, staring into their eyes as though searching for weakness, punishing them for the slightest flinch or tremor. Such stories painted her not merely as strict, but as a woman who turned ordinary discipline into a theater of control. Thurzo recorded these depositions carefully, though the conditions under which they were given remain uncertain. Many witnesses were peasants, speaking before nobles who carried power over their lives. Others were servants who had once feared Elizabeth and now feared the investigators. In an age when torture was common in judicial questioning, the line between truth and invention was blurred beyond recognition. Yet the sheer number of testimonies, over 300 by some counts, gave the accusations a weight that no defense could easily dismiss. By December of El Lo Yao Ling, Thurzo had resolved to act. He gathered a party of men and rode through the snow-covered hills toward Čachtice Castle. The journey itself was heavy with foreboding. Villagers followed at a distance, their torches glowing in the dark like watchful eyes. The castle loomed above them, its towers cutting a black silhouette against the winter sky. For those who had whispered of its secrets for years, the night felt like a reckoning. The arrival at the castle has been told in many ways. Some accounts say Thurzo entered quietly, slipping through the gates while the household slept. Others insist he marched openly, his men in armor, their boots echoing against the stones. Whatever the truth, the effect was the same. Elizabeth's private world was about to be torn open. According to official records, Thurzo's men found several young women within the castle, some still alive, some in poor condition, and others said to have recently perished. The scene, as described, was one of disorder and fear. Servants were taken into custody and questioned immediately. Elizabeth herself confronted Thurzo, demanding to know why he intruded on her home. He replied in the name of the king. The accounts of that night grew more sensational with every retelling. Some chroniclers wrote that Thurzo discovered hidden chambers filled with strange devices. Others claimed he found lists of names, records of girls brought to the castle who had never returned. Still others insisted he saw signs of rituals, candles arranged in patterns, herbs scattered on tables. The reality is difficult to know, for every witness colored their story with fear, memory, or political motive. But what mattered was not absolute truth. It was the picture being painted for the world. The following days were filled with depositions. Servants confessed in detail, describing the punishments they had seen or suffered. Some spoke of being locked in dark rooms for days at a time. Others said they had been forced to endure hours of silence, unable to move or speak without permission. Still others repeated the old rumor that Elizabeth sought beauty through strange practices, studying her reflection endlessly, demanding remedies for every blemish, and growing furious when age dared to touch her skin. One servant claimed that Elizabeth had once flown into a rage when she saw a stain of blood on a noblewoman's gown. From this moment, he said, her obsession deepened. Was this testimony fact, or merely the echo of the infamous legend that she bathed in blood? We cannot know, but it was written into the record, and once written, it became part of her story. The more testimonies were gathered, the more Elizabeth's image shifted from noblewoman to monster. Peasants who had once spoken of her with respect now described her with dread. Nobles who envied her lands spoke freely of her downfall. Even her defenders grew quiet, unable to speak against the tide of accusation. By the time the investigation concluded, the verdict had already been reached in the minds of many. Thurzo himself wrote to the king that Elizabeth's crimes were beyond question. He called her guilty of acts too numerous and terrible to list, though, in truth, much of his evidence was hearsay. Still, it was enough, for in that moment the crown did not need certainty. It needed justification. The raid on Lactis and the testimonies that followed sealed Elizabeth's fate. She was placed under house arrest, her household dismantled, her servants imprisoned. Some were executed after confessing under torture. Others disappeared into silence. Elizabeth alone was spared the trial of a commoner. Her noble blood protected her from the public humiliation of the scaffold. Instead, she would be confined within the very walls that had once been her fortress. To the villagers, the raid confirmed every suspicion. They whispered that justice had finally come, that the woman who haunted their imaginations had been caught in her own web. Yet among the nobility, the question lingered. Was she truly guilty of every charge? Or had politics done what whispers could not? The truth remains locked within the walls of Lactis, buried beneath centuries of retelling. But one thing is certain. After that night, Elizabeth Báthory would never again walk free. Elizabeth Báthory never faced the courtroom. No judge stood before her. No jury was summoned. No defense was mounted on her behalf. For the most powerful families of Hungary, a trial of this scale would have been scandalous, dangerous, and unpredictable. Instead, her punishment was arranged behind closed doors. The charges were declared sufficient. The testimonies had been collected in overwhelming number. The crown had all it needed to condemn her, not in the formal sense of law, but in the quieter language of politics. And so she was sentenced to spend the remainder of her life locked within the walls of her own fortress, Čachtice Castle. Some said the countess was bricked into her chambers, the stones sealing her into darkness, with only a narrow opening left for the passing of food. Others claimed she was permitted to move within a suite of rooms, always under guard, her freedom stripped but her dignity nominally preserved. Which version is true cannot be known. But for the villagers in the valley, the harsher tale became the more believable one. They told each other that the woman who had once ruled them with an iron hand now sat in a prison of her own making, entombed within her castle walls, while life continued beyond. At first, her confinement may have felt like resistance, like a temporary insult to be overturned. Elizabeth had spent her life commanding servants, issuing orders, arranging alliances. To be told she could not leave her rooms must have struck her as absurd, even laughable. But as the days became weeks and the weeks months, the truth settled in like frost upon stone. She was not free. She would never again walk the forests of her lands, never again descend the winding road that led from the castle gates to the villages below. The halls that had once been filled with the music of feasts grew silent. The great chambers that had hosted visiting nobles now stood empty. Servants moved through the castle with hushed steps, their numbers reduced. The fortress became less a home than a mausoleum, a place of memory where its mistress lived on in shadow. Elizabeth was no longer the host of banquets, but the hidden prisoner, her presence reduced to a whisper behind locked doors. The seasons turned around her confinement. In spring, the valley below filled with green shoots, and the peasants planted fields of barley and wheat. In summer, the air shimmered with heat, and the forests buzzed with cicadas. In autumn, smoke rose from the chimneys of farmhouses as harvest fires burned. And in winter, the snow came down in drifts, pressing against the castle walls, muffling every sound. Through it all, Elizabeth remained within, the seasons changing without her, time marching on in silence. Villagers swore they could see her candle burning at night. They claimed that a faint glow sometimes appeared in the highest windows, as though she still walked her chambers with restless steps, unable to sleep. A shepherd once told that he looked up from his flock on a moonlit night and saw a figure standing in the window, staring down at the valley. He swore it was Elizabeth, though she had not been seen in public for years. Whether he truly saw her or only the play of shadows, the story spread and the legend deepened. Within her confinement, Elizabeth is said to have kept writing. Letters from these years reveal her mind was still sharp, her tone commanding, though tinged with bitterness. She wrote to ensure her children's inheritance, to argue for the protection of her estates, to complain of her treatment. In one letter she wrote of her health, saying that her body weakened but her spirit remained. These writings show a woman who refused to admit guilt, who maintained her nobility in word if not in freedom. Yet, for all the formality of her pen, the reality of her life was silence. Her footsteps echoed against stone walls. Her voice carried only to the guards who delivered her meals. The once great castle became smaller with each passing day, until it was little more than a prison. The villagers imagined her differently. They told tales of her restlessness, of her pacing late at night, speaking to portraits hung on her walls. Some swore she whispered to herself, holding conversations with voices only she could hear. Others said she spent hours staring into mirrors, searching for signs of age, furious at every wrinkle, every gray hair. These were stories shaped by fear and imagination, but they filled the emptiness left by her absence. A tale spread of a servant who claimed to have heard Elizabeth praying through the stone walls. Her voice, he said, was low and steady, chanting words in Latin, sometimes repeating the same phrase for hours. Was this the discipline of a devout woman, or the obsession of one clinging to control? No one could decide, but the image of the imprisoned countess, pacing in candlelight, murmuring prayers into the stones, became fixed in the minds of the people. Other tales were darker still. One visitor to the village claimed he heard a faint cry from the castle one stormy night, as if a woman had called out from high within the fortress. The villagers whispered that it was Elizabeth, raging at her captors, demanding freedom. Others said it was not her voice at all, but something else, the spirits of those who had perished in her service, their cries echoing through the walls of her prison. Each retelling blurred the line further between history and haunting. For the peasants who had once feared her presence, her imprisonment brought little comfort. If anything, it made her seem more spectral. She was no longer the countess who rode through villages with servants at her side. She was now a shadow, unseen, unheard, but believed to linger in every flicker of candlelight. Fear of her did not vanish with her confinement. It only changed shape. Meanwhile, the crown had achieved what it wanted. Elizabeth's power was broken, her fortune weakened, much of her wealth was confiscated, her estates seized or diminished. Her family's name was tarnished, their influence curtailed. The political goal had been met. The woman herself was left to wither away in silence, her legend growing larger with every year of isolation. In the final years of her confinement, Elizabeth's health declined. Reports say she often complained of weakness, of feeling cold, of being unable to sleep. The guards noted her restlessness, her constant pacing. One claimed she stood at her window each night, staring into the darkness, her hands pressed against the stone. Another wrote that she asked for more candles than could be spared, as though she feared the dark itself. On the night of August 20th, 1614, she is said to have told her guard that her hands were cold. He assured her she was only tired. By the next morning, she was dead. She was 54 years old. Her burial was swift. At first, she was interred at the church in Lactis, but the villagers, unwilling to have her rest among them, demanded her body be moved. Some say she was taken to the Bathory family crypt at Ext, far from the lands she once ruled. Others insist her remains never left the castle at all, that they were hidden within its walls, her grave unmarked to prevent desecration. To this day, no one knows where she lies. Her absence only deepened her legend. Without a grave to visit, her story remained unanchored, free to drift and grow. She became less a woman and more a symbol of cruelty, of power, of the thin line between truth and rumor. In the centuries that followed, her tale was told again and again. In the dark parlors of the 18th century, she was described as a witch, a woman who had consorted with the devil. In the Gothic literature of the 19th century, she became a vampire, bathing in blood to preserve her youth. In the 20th century, she was cast as a monster, the Blood Countess, rival to Dracula himself. And yet, within all these retellings, the truth of her confinement lingers quietly. She was not burned, not executed, not dragged through the streets. She died in silence, hidden from the world, locked away in the same stone fortress that had once stood as a symbol of her power. Čachtice Castle still stands, though in ruins. Its walls crumble, its halls open to the wind. Visitors walk its paths, imagining the life of the woman who once ruled within. Some claim the air feels heavier there, as if the castle itself remembers. Others say that at dusk, when the sky darkens and the forest swallows the light, you can still see a flicker in the windows, a candle burning in the chambers of a countess long gone. Elizabeth Báthory never stood trial, but her punishment was carried out all the same. The silence of her final years echoes louder than any sentence a court could have passed, and in that silence her legend was born anew. Elizabeth Báthory died quietly in the late summer of 1614. There were no public executions, no burning at the stake, no grand spectacle to mark her passing. Instead, the end of her life came with silence, in a locked chamber within the walls of Čachtice Castle. On the evening before her death, she complained to her guard that her hands felt cold. It was a simple remark, almost mundane, but it was the last thing she ever spoke aloud to another living soul. By the following morning, she was gone. At 54 years old, the woman who had been called the most powerful noblewoman in Hungary, and later, the cruelest, had left the world as quietly as she had lived loudly. Her death did not bring closure. In truth, it only stirred more questions, more unease, more whispers. The news spread quickly through the valley, carried by peasants from farmhouse to farmhouse, from tavern to tavern. Some said it was a relief that the curse was finally lifted. Others murmured that it was only the beginning, that death would not contain her. The villagers feared her body. When word came that she had been buried in the church at Čachtice, the people rose in protest. They did not want her remains resting in sacred ground. They said the earth itself would reject her. They demanded that her coffin be removed, and so it was. What happened next is uncertain. Some sources insist she was taken to the Bathory family crypt in Ext, far to the east, where her ancestors lay in solemn stone tombs. Others claim her coffin was hidden secretly within the castle itself, placed in an unmarked grave to prevent disturbance. And still others whisper that she was never buried at all, that her body was hidden away, lost to time, her bones scattered or burned. The truth is lost, and perhaps that is why her story endures, because there is no place to point to and say, "Here lies Elizabeth Báthory." Without a grave, her presence became spectral. The villagers swore she still walked among them. Shepherds claimed to see a pale figure drifting along the castle walls at dusk. Farmers said their animals grew restless near the fortress, lowing and braying as if sensing something unseen. A priest wrote that the church bells rang faintly on their own one evening, with no hand upon the rope. To the people who lived beneath the shadow of Čachtice, her absence was more haunting than her life had ever been. The castle itself grew more sinister. Empty halls echoed with the wind. Candles sputtered and went out without reason. Visitors described a heaviness in the air, as though unseen eyes followed them through the corridors. Some servants refused to work there at night, insisting they heard footsteps in the upper chambers when no one was confined there anymore. Legends of her ghost spread quickly. One tale told of a villager who dared to climb the hill after dark, curious to see the castle where the Countess had died. He swore he saw a woman standing in a window, her gown pale, her face obscured by shadow. Terrified, he fled. But when he told the story in the tavern, others nodded. They too had seen the same figure. Another story claimed that a traveler passing through the valley stopped to rest beneath the castle walls. In the night he woke to the sound of soft weeping above him. When he looked up, the windows were dark, but the sound continued until dawn. The folklore of her ghost blended with the accusations of her life. People whispered that she still roamed in search of the servants she had lost, calling their names through the corridors. Others said she stood by mirrors, unable to escape the reflection of age she had once fought so hard to deny. A few even believed her spirit wandered the valley itself, drifting along the fields where peasants worked, watching silently from the tree line. Her absence created a vacuum that rumor eagerly filled. For some, she became a warning, the tale of a noble woman whose cruelty brought about her downfall. For others, she became a supernatural threat, a restless soul denied peace. Children were warned not to linger too long near the castle ruins, lest the Countess take notice. Travelers were told to avoid the fortress at night. The valley itself became a place of caution, shaped by her memory. Meanwhile, historians and chroniclers debated her fate. Was she truly guilty of all that had been said? Or had she been a victim of politics, her enemies weaving a web of lies to strip her of her fortune? Some pointed to the contradictions in testimony, the inconsistencies in numbers, the clear benefit to those who stood to gain from her ruin. Others argued that where there was so much smoke, there must have been fire. But with her death, the chance to uncover the truth slipped away. For Elizabeth's death was not an ending, but a transformation. She was no longer the mistress of estates, the wife of a warrior, the manager of servants. She had become a figure of myth, a presence that loomed larger in absence than she ever had in life. The ruins of Čachtice Castle still stand today, crumbling and silent. Visitors walk its paths, pausing in the chambers where she was said to have been confined. Some claim the air feels colder there, heavier, as if the stones themselves still hold her memory. At sunset, when the sky burns red behind the hills, the shadows lengthen, and the fortress looks once more like the haunted prison it became for the villagers who lived beneath it 4 centuries ago. Her death did not release them from fear. If anything, it deepened it, because now Elizabeth Báthory belonged to no one. She was not the Countess, not the prisoner, not even the corpse in a coffin. She was a ghost, and ghosts do not stay confined. Shadows of a legend, Elizabeth Báthory died in silence, but her story did not. Death has a way of fixing certain figures in place, and in her case, it fixed her not as a noblewoman, not as a widow, not even as a prisoner. It fixed her as something darker, a symbol, a whisper, a ghost in history's long corridors. The decades after her passing were filled with retellings. Servants who had once spoken carefully about their mistress now told their stories with more freedom. And every time they were told, they grew taller. A harsh scolding became a beating. A long vigil became a night of torment. A disappearance became a murder. The boundary between memory and imagination dissolved. By the middle of the 17th century, Elizabeth Báthory was no longer a person in the minds of many. She was a legend. The villagers of Lactus told their children to avoid the castle hill at night. They said the countess still wandered there, her gown whispering against the stone, her pale hands pressed against the windows. Shepherds claimed their flocks refused to graze near the walls. Peasants swore they saw candlelight in chambers that had long been sealed. Over time, the fortress itself became a kind of haunted monument. Even in ruins, it seemed to bear her shadow. In the 18th century, travelers carried her story further. Priests wrote of her as a cautionary tale of pride and cruelty. Scholars listed her among the examples of women whose power had been twisted into evil. Her name appeared in sermons, in chronicles, and in whispered conversations in taverns. She was compared to witches burned at the stake, to nobles accused of consorting with the devil, to figures whose lives blurred into folklore. By the 19th century, her tale had entered the world of Gothic literature. Writers looking for inspiration in dark castles and cruel nobles found in her story the perfect shape. Elizabeth became the Blood Countess, said to have bathed in the blood of maidens to preserve her youth. There is no evidence this ever occurred, but the image was too vivid to ignore. It appeared in books, poems, and plays. Two audiences hungry for stories of vampires. Her tales seemed like a prelude to Dracula himself. Indeed, when Bram Stoker wrote Dracula in 1897, some scholars believe he drew upon her legend as inspiration. Both figures were nobles from the Carpathian region. Both were accused of cruelty, of unnatural practices, of feeding on the lives of others. Both lived in castles that loomed over villages, inspiring awe and fear. And both were remembered not for the truth of their lives, but for the legends that grew around them. In the centuries since, Elizabeth Báthory has been retold again and again. She appears in novels, in films, in music, in folklore. She is described as a witch, as a vampire, as a symbol of vanity taken to monstrous extremes. Portray her as a villain without question, the cruelest woman who ever lived. Others reinterpret her as a victim, a noble woman destroyed by conspiracy and rumor, her reputation blackened by those who stood to gain from her fall. The ambiguity has only kept her legend alive. What makes her story endure is not just the accusations of cruelty. It is the atmosphere that surrounds them. The castle on the hill, the candlelight in the windows, the silence of confinement, the uncertainty of her grave. Without these details, she might have been forgotten as another noble caught in politics. With them, she became a figure of endless fascination. Even today, visitors walk the ruins of Čachtice Castle. to touch the crumbling stones, peer into the empty chambers, and imagine the life of the countess who once lived there. Some say the air grows colder as night falls, that the forest around the hill grows quiet as if listening. Others insist they see a flicker of light in the upper windows, though the chambers have been empty for centuries. The legend persists because it feeds on silence and imagination, the two things history leaves behind in greatest measure. Elizabeth Báthory remains one of history's great enigmas. Was she truly guilty of the horrors described, or was she destroyed by envy, politics, and exaggeration? Historians debate it still, and perhaps they always will. What cannot be debated is her place in the cultural imagination. She has become a story told by candlelight, a name whispered in the dark, a shadow in the lineage of myths that haunt the human mind. And perhaps that is the most fitting ending. For the countess who once sought to control every corner of her world has lost control of her own memory. She no longer belongs to herself, or even to history. She belongs to the stories told about her, to the whispers carried through centuries, to the legends that outlive the truth. So the candle burns low. The castle walls stand in ruin. The wind moves through the corridors where once she paced, and somewhere in the distance the villagers still tell their children, "Do not wander near the hill at night. Do not follow the flicker of candlelight in the windows, for the countess is still there, and she always will be." And so the story fades, like candlelight burning low. Elizabeth Báthory remains, part history, part legend, and part shadow. Whether guilty or framed, forgotten or immortalized, her name still drifts through the corridors of time, a reminder that history is not only written in ink, but in whispers. Close your eyes now. Let the castle walls dissolve into silence, and let sleep take you where even the countess cannot follow. Thank you for listening to Whispering Tomes, obscure histories for sleep and relaxation.